It starts with a light, a tiny red icon on the dash, right in the middle of your eye line, and a message that reads something like, oil pressure fault, stop the vehicle, no warning shot, no slow decline. You're doing 60 on the M25, radio on, thinking about your evening, and then your car is telling you to pull over right now, or risk turning several £1,000s of engineering into scrap metal. That scene is playing out on hard shoulders and side streets across Britain more often than anyone in the motor trade wants to admit, not to some rare imported supercar, to Corsas, to Fiestas, to 3-year-old family hatchbacks that were sold as the sensible, efficient, modern choice. The engines that were supposed to be the clever answer to fuel economy and emissions targets are now, a decade or so into their working life, turning into one of the most expensive headaches in British motoring. Here's the thing nobody tells you when you buy a small turbocharged petrol car. The very technology that makes it feel punchy and sip fuel like a much smaller engine is also the technology most likely to leave you stranded. And because so many manufacturers reached for the same trick at roughly the same time, in roughly the same decade, a huge slice of the UK's car park is now aging into the danger zone together. Industry estimates, once you add up the model lines with documented turbo and timing weaknesses still on British roads today, put the number of vehicles carrying some version of this risk at somewhere around 4.6 million. That's not one single recall, it's not one single fault. It's a cluster of related problems, born from the same industry-wide decision, converging on drivers at the same moment. And whether your car is on that list might come down to nothing more than a badge on the boot and a date on the logbook. Think about that for a second. Somewhere close to 1 in 10 cars currently registered in this country carries some flavour of this risk, sitting on driveways from Cornwall to Aberdeen, most of them driven by people who've never heard the phrase wet belt in their life and have no reason to. They service their car when the reminder pops up. They top up the washer fluid. They assume, reasonably, that a car built and sold by a household name manufacturer, checked over at every MOT, is fundamentally sound underneath the bodywork. For a huge number of them, that assumption is about to be tested. Let's actually talk about what a turbocharger is doing under there, because it matters for understanding why this particular part fails the way it does. A turbo is essentially 2 fans joined by a shaft, sat in the exhaust stream. Hot exhaust gas spins one fan, that spins the shaft, and the shaft spins a second fan, that forces extra air into the engine, letting it burn more fuel and produce more power than its size would otherwise allow. That shaft spins at speeds most people can't really picture, well over 100,000 revolutions a minute on plenty of small units, faster than a dentist's drill, riding on a wafer-thin film of oil instead of solid bearings, because nothing solid could survive that kind of friction for long. Cut that oil film even slightly, contaminate it with debris, or starve it for even a second or two, and that spinning shaft goes from a precision instrument to scrap metal in the time it takes to notice something's wrong. So how did we get here? Rewind to the early 2010s. Emissions regulations were tightening fast, CO2 targets were biting, and fuel prices had drivers obsessing over miles per gallon in a way they hadn't since the 70s. Manufacturers needed a way to keep performance where customers expected it, while shrinking engines down to sip less petrol and diesel. The answer, almost across the entire industry at once, was downsizing plus turbocharging. Take a small, light 3 or 4 cylinder block, strap a turbocharger to it, and suddenly you've got an engine that drives like something a size bigger, while sipping fuel like something a size smaller. On paper, brilliant. In the real world of British weather, stop-start traffic, and drivers who don't always let a hot engine idle down before switching off, it turned out to be a much riskier bet than the marketing brochures let on. Ford was one of the first in with this approach at scale, and their EcoBoost family became the default engine in half the Fiestas and Focuses on the road. The 1-litre 3-cylinder version, fitted broadly across cars built between 2012 and 2020, developed a reputation that owners' forums still argue about today. The design uses what's called a wet belt, a timing belt that runs inside the engine, submerged in oil, rather than out front where you can see it and where a mechanic can eyeball its condition at a glance. Ford's reasoning was sound in theory. A belt in oil runs cooler, quieter, with less friction. In practice, after years of heat cycles, that belt starts to degrade, and instead of staying in one piece, it sheds tiny rubber fragments straight into the oil supply. And here's where the turbo comes back into the story, because a turbocharger depends on a constant, clean supply of oil to keep its bearings spinning at speeds that would put a jet engine to shame. We're talking well over 100,000 revolutions a minute on some units. Feed that spinning shaft oil that's contaminated with belt debris, or oil that's simply not getting through because a strainer downstream is clogged, and you don't get a slow decline. You get a seized bearing, a smoking exhaust, and a turbocharger that's finished. Along with, often, the engine it was bolted to. Ford weren't alone. Stellantis, the parent group behind Peugeot, Citroën, Vauxhall and DS, rolled out their own version of the same idea almost simultaneously. Their 1.0 and 1.2-litre PureTech 3-cylinder engine ended up under the bonnet of an enormous range of everyday British cars: Peugeot 208S and 308S, Citroën C3S and C4S, Vauxhall Corsas, Astras, Crosslands, Grandlands and Mockers, DS3S. If you've hired a small hatchback from an airport rental desk in the last 8 years, there's a decent chance you've driven one without realizing it. The PureTech engine uses the same wet belt principle, and it developed the exact same failure mode, arguably worse. Owners describe a very specific warning sequence. The oil pressure light flickers on under hard braking or through a tight corner, then flickers off again once you're driving normally. It looks like nothing. It looks like the kind of thing you'd mention at the next service and forget about. In reality, it means the oil pickup strainer in the sump is already partially blocked with shredded belt material, and the engine is running on borrowed time. Peugeot issued a recall back in 2021 covering some of the earliest, worst affected units. But recall notices only ever tell part of the story. Owners on forums like Money Saving Expert have been considerably blunter about it, describing the wet belt failure as a known design fault, and asking in thread after thread what they're supposed to do about a car that's failed through no fault of their driving or maintenance. Stellantis eventually responded with something bigger than a standard recall: a compensation portal, extended to UK customers, covering excessive oil consumption and premature belt failure on cars registered with these engines between January 2022 and December 2024, alongside an extended warranty on early units running out to 10 years or 112,000 miles. That's not the kind of gesture a manufacturer makes over a minor, one-off niggle. That's the kind of gesture a manufacturer makes when the alternative is a courtroom. Now, picture the owner, not a named individual, because these stories repeat themselves too often across too many driveways to be about one person, but a composite of exactly the kind of driver this hits hardest. A parent doing the school run in a 5-year-old Corsa, bought used, serviced on time at the local garage, no idea the belt inside the block has a shelf life measured in years rather than miles. The warning light flickers on one wet Tuesday morning. By the time it's properly diagnosed, the quote on the table reads somewhere between £1,000 and £2,500 for a full turbo and belt replacement on a car that might only be worth £3,000 or £4,000 to begin with. That's not a repair bill. That's a decision about whether the car is worth saving at all. Multiply that one driveway by the tens of thousands of near-identical calls happening at independent garages across the country every single month, and you start to understand why this isn't a niche complaint buried in an owner's forum. It's a genuine strain on household budgets that were already stretched thin before a warning light ever appeared. Some owners scrape together the money and fix it, because scrapping a car they still owe finance on isn't really a choice at all. Others limp along on a partial repair, replacing just the belt and hoping the turbo survived the debris, which sometimes works and sometimes buys them 6 more months before the same light comes back on for good. And petrol turbos aren't the only culprits in this story. Diesel had its own reckoning, and BMW's N47 engine is the case study every mechanic in the country can recite from memory. Fitted across a huge run of 1, 3 and 5 series diesels built between roughly 2007 and 2014, the N47 became infamous for a completely different mechanical failure with an unnervingly similar outcome. The internal timing chain, rather than a belt this time, would stretch and snap, typically somewhere between 40 and 80,000 miles. The tell was a distinctive rattle on a cold startup, the kind of noise that a driver might dismiss as normal diesel clatter until the day it isn't. BMW made design changes partway through production that reduced how often it happened, but crucially, they never issued a full UK safety recall. The problem was serious enough to feature on BBC Watchdog and to fill entire forum sections on sites like Pistonheads, with owners comparing notes, yet it was handled model generation by model generation rather than with the kind of blanket recall that forces every affected owner into a garage. There's a legal angle to the N47 story that's worth sitting with for a second, because it explains why so many owners feel like they've been left to fight this alone. Without a formal safety recall, a driver whose timing chain lets go at 50,000 miles is largely on their own to prove the failure was down to a manufacturing weakness rather than normal wear, often by paying for an independent engineering report before a dealer or a manufacturer will even discuss a goodwill contribution. Some owners have succeeded, particularly where service history is spotless, and the failure happened well within what most people would consider a reasonable working life for an engine. Plenty of others simply absorbed the cost, because fighting a global manufacturer through the small claims track over a rattling diesel isn't exactly most people's idea of a fun way to spend a weekend. It isn't just Ford, Stellantis and BMW either. Look at the data coming out of UK engine replacement specialists, drawn from tens of thousands of real repair quotes processed over the past year, and a clear pattern falls out. Timing chain issues account for the largest single share of engine replacements nationally. Turbo failures make up a meaningful chunk right behind DPF and crankshaft problems, and the manufacturers dominating those quote requests read like a who's who of the last 15 years of British driveways. BMW, with its N47, B47 and N57 units, Land Rover with the SDV6, TDV6 and Ingenium engines, and Mercedes with the OM651 and OM642. Different badges, different engineering teams, strikingly similar story. Engines built smaller, turned harder, and pushed closer to their limits than the previous generation ever was. Land Rover's diesel lineup tells almost the same story from a different angle. The SDV6 and TDV6 units found their way into Discoveries and Range Rovers that owners bought specifically because they were supposed to shrug off hard use, only for timing chain tensioners and turbo actuators to become recurring, well-documented weak points once the miles piled on. Mercedes drivers weren't spared either. The OM651 four-cylinder diesel, fitted across a huge swathe of C-Class, E-Class and Vito models, developed its own reputation for balance shaft and timing chain wear that mechanics up and down the country now recognize almost on sound alone, a particular rattling drone that seasoned technicians can diagnose from the next bay over before the car's even up on the ramp. What ties every one of these engine families together isn't the badge on the bonnet, it's the era. Every single one of them was designed, approved and pushed into mass production during the exact same regulatory squeeze, when every manufacturer on the planet was racing to hit the same emissions targets on roughly the same timeline, and every engineering department was making strikingly similar trade-offs under similar pressure. Smaller capacity, higher boost, tighter tolerances, components designed to a cost and a deadline, rather than to the kind of enormous old-fashioned safety margin that made engines from the 80s and 90s feel like they'd run forever on nothing but oil changes and hope. There's a reason all of this is converging right now, in this specific moment on UK roads, rather than trickling in gradually the way mechanical faults usually do. The average age of a car on Britain's roads has just ticked up to 9.7 years, and for the first time on record, more than 45% of the entire national fleet has now been in service for over a decade. People aren't trading in their cars every 3 years the way they used to. Between the cost of living squeeze and the price of anything new, drivers are holding on to what they've got, servicing it, and hoping it holds together. Which means the exact generation of downsized turbo engines, built specifically to hit emissions targets between roughly 2011 and 2020, the ones with wet belts submerged in oil, the ones with timing chains rated for a working life that's now expiring, are all arriving at their danger zone within the same few years, on the same roads, in the same used car market, at the same time drivers can least afford a 5-figure surprise. Here's a detail that catches a lot of owners out and comes up constantly in comments under videos on exactly this subject. People assume a car warranty, or their motor insurance, will step in and cover a turbo or engine failure. Often, it won't. Most manufacturer and third-party warranties explicitly exclude anything classed as wear and tear, and proving a belt or a timing chain failed through a manufacturing weakness rather than ordinary use means gathering service history, sometimes fighting the manufacturer directly, sometimes involving a solicitor. Insurance, meanwhile, is built around sudden accidental damage, not a slow mechanical failure that was, in hindsight, baked into the design from the day the car left the factory. That gap between what people assume is covered and what's actually covered is exactly where so many of these stories turn from an inconvenience into a financial disaster. And the second thing that comes up again and again in owner discussions, the thing worth genuinely paying attention to if you're driving one of these engines right now, that flickering warning light under braking or cornering, isn't nothing. It isn't a sensor glitch to ignore until the next service. On the PureTech engines especially, it's often the very first, and sometimes the only, warning you get before the belt debris does serious damage. Catch it at that stage, with an early strip down and clean, and you might be looking at a bill in the low hundreds. Ignore it for even a few more weeks of driving, and you're potentially looking at a full engine replacement. So where does that leave 4.6 million drivers, give or take, sitting behind the wheel of a car built during exactly this window, with exactly this kind of engine? It isn't really a story about bad engineering in the sense of incompetence. turbocharging genuinely delivered on its promise of decent performance from a smaller, more efficient unit. That part of the bargain was kept. What got sacrificed, in engine bay after engine bay, was the enormous safety margin that older, simpler, naturally aspirated engines used to have built in almost by accident. Fewer moving parts, more tolerance for a missed service, more forgiveness for a driver who didn't know the finer points of oil specification. That forgiveness is largely gone from this generation of engines, replaced by tighter tolerances, higher pressures, and components with a genuine finite shelf life that most owners were never told about at the point of sale. The real lesson buried in all of this isn't to panic and sell up. It's to actually know what's sitting under your bonnet. Pull your service history. Check whether your specific engine code has a known wet belt or timing chain weakness, because the interval for changing that belt is often measured in years as much as miles, and plenty of owners have no idea there's a clock running at all, separate from the mileage on the dial. If your dashboard ever throws up an oil pressure warning, even one that clears itself after a few seconds, treat it the way you'd treat a smoke alarm going off, not as background noise to tune out, but as the one moment where catching the problem early is the difference between a manageable repair bill and a written-off engine. But observe, there's something almost unfair about it, honestly. These aren't reckless drivers in modified cars pushing engines past their limits. These are ordinary people doing the school run, the commute, the weekly shop, in cars that were marketed, quite deliberately, as the safe, sensible, efficient choice. If that's the car sitting on your driveway right now, or the one you're eyeing up on a used car listing this week, it's worth 5 minutes checking the engine code before you check the price. And if you've already lived through one of these failures, the light, the rattle, the quote that made your stomach drop, you're far from the only one. Drop it in the comments, tell us what it cost you and how you found out, because the more of these stories get told out loud, the harder it gets for this to keep quietly catching people out.